we talked also this week that we're not only doing critical reflection, but a key element of how to do critical reflection well has to do with becoming aware of our context, of the cultural impact around us. And frequently we're not aware about not only the cultural impact, say, on our daily life, the fact that I use an iPhone or I watch movies or I take advantage of sociology or psychology, but also that as we do that, we're also becoming aware that there was a cultural impact on the way that Scripture's been interpreted to us. So the Reformation came out of very specific, concrete, on-the-ground cultural realities that aren't our realities. The same thing with Wesleyan theology, that's my theology. Those came out of a very particular few decades in a particular nation at a particular time that formed those practices and habits in theology. And so even though I may honor and want to adopt certain elements of my historical theology, my tradition, I need to do that with an awareness of the assumptions behind, but also the cultural context that created that. And so I want to talk about this social theory with three particular elements involved. And that is that there's a larger society. Those are shaped by the boxes, the 90-degree angles here. Society is about the larger systems in which we all work. This would be an empire. This would be economic systems. These are the larger structures that groups of people create for a common life. They may like them, not like them, but they're on the ground and they're ahead of us. We're not the ones generally inventing them. Inside a society, look at the circles. The circles are the cultures. Cultures are habitual ways that a particular group of people have adopted, been embedded in, and that they perpetuate then to their next generation. So a culture may be an ethnic group, it may be a national group, it may be a smaller group of some kind, but a culture passes on habits of a peoplehood, not just the formal structures of a societal system, but cultural realities, often language, other habits. We'll look at some other elements of that. The triangles I'm trying to use as a way to talk about a church. That inside society and in between and among cultures, there are churches, communities. These communities may have more than one culture or may just have one culture. They may be part of a large society like an empire, a nation, or they may be part of a smaller society, a state or a city. All of these communities, cultures, societies are constantly interacting. You don't ever just do one. So the church you're in, that I've had you do some reflection on and you will continue to work with, has an impact of ethnic cultures, other cultures, as well as society. The theology that you inhabit has had an impact from cultures as well as society. So let's look a little bit more detailed. And by the way, this is in chapter 3 of the book that I wrote with Juan Martinez. But I want to look through this because we need to start naming some elements of the society, elements of culture that have shaped us and that continue to shape us. So society in that first column is composed of micro, smaller, and macro systems that structure the ways of a society across multiple cultures and communities. And these particular systems set and pursue goals. So social structures define and allocate, provide for the use of relationships. What's it mean to have a marriage or a family? What are other friendship structures about? How about the relationships of employment? And so a society sets up particular structures for how these relationships are defined, how they operate. Economic structures define, allocate, and provide for the use of resources. So again, inside a society, large, international, multinational economics, or small, how taxes work in Los Angeles. So economic structures define what money economics are for. They allocate it, who's at the bottom of the rung, who's higher up, and then provide for the use of those resources, what they're good for. And political structures define, allocate, and provide for the use of power. Formally, politics, but informally, management, labor, town councils, how money has an influence on politics. And finally, legal structures that define, allocate, and provide for the use of legitimacy. Now we know all of these are problematic. They look different depending on where you are inside the society. But this society power then is shaping elements of church, elements of cultures. So, for instance, look at the impact of society economic structures on something like a religious holiday, Christmas. And you start seeing the impact that society has on theological, ecclesial, missional praxis. Let's look for a moment at the middle column. The culture embodies a matrix of social patterns. Norms, the normal way we act. This is the way we think, the way we view the world. These are beliefs and values, honesty, belief in the supernatural, practices, how I engage the practice of honesty, how I engage the value of caring for a neighbor. There are traditions that are part of cultures. These traditions are what are our heritage and what we inherit through a period of years. A culture also has certain patterned meanings. We may say family means something, but how do we pattern that meaning? How do we live out parental relationships? How do we live out sibling relationships? So there's patterns to that. That's where the values get practiced in certain patterns. Development has to do with how we increasingly embody elements of a culture. And it may be by enculturation, somebody coming into the culture or somebody growing up in the culture. So development is a matter of learning and embodying, enculturating particular cultural practices. Symbolic representation is how we put this into language or arts or other means of communication. We put meaning into symbols, gestures, and those symbols then pass on meaning and become part of a culture. Perception, even how you or I perceive something, a day, a breeze, a color, a piece of art, a gesture. Our perceptions are different because our culture trains us to pay attention to certain things. And so a person in a particular culture and its climate, or a person in a particular culture and their garb are perceptive of things because sensory input is filtered, it's received, and it's processed. So you are culturally formed to perceive things, you're culturally formed to ignore things. Are you formed to ignore a poor person? Are you formed to perceive a poor person? So all of these are culturally embedded. They're not neutral. They're something we receive as part of a culture. Conation has to do with character, tendencies, wisdom, and a culture passes on its approach to conation, to character. And finally, extension. That's how we deal with the borders of a culture, the encounters with outsiders. And again, cultures are different in how they work at that border. So we've got society, we've got cultures inside a society, and then we're shaping communities, which is a local group of persons. They have memories inherited from those before them. They cooperate in side-by-side activities. Those side-by-side activities are rooted in shared meanings. There's a shared hope and imagination concerning a future together. If a group can't say, here's how we're moving into the future, then it's not a community. It may be a society or a culture. But a community, or this localized group, has particular ways of envisioning and taking steps toward a shared future. There's relative intimacy, proximity, and permanence. By relative, I mean these aren't tightly defined. But how deeply we speak into each other's lives is more a matter of community than society. There's what's called, sociologists talk about unspecialized face-to-face association. That means we run into each other without scheduling. So for instance, you really can't develop a community in the 10 weeks of your video conferences in this class because those are scheduled, those are explicitly part of a structured, a societal structure called a school. But the people that you run into day in and day out, that forms your community. And a community adapts and resists, embraces and challenges the influences of the other two columns, the culture and the society. And that's also a way of saying this community group, this localized, unspecialized group of people, the society is constantly making it hard to be that community because the society's powers want to influence it. The same with the culture. The culture's habits, say, of Confucianism or consumer capitalism or whatever elements of a culture that you've grown up with, they put forces on a community, a smaller group of people, to conform to that community. And so a community like a church is constantly being challenged to, it's under pressure by cultures, by society, to behave in certain ways. So again, chapter 3 of Roxborough or of Branson and Martinez will explain these more and look at why they're important as we talk about missional ecclesiology and leadership.